Alright, back again for another video. I know, surprise, surprise. The last one took about a year, but I'm back again with another one already. So today, what we're talking about is the most OP, most overpowered things in Dust. And for anybody who played, you know that was a lot of things. So what we're going to do, it's like a top 10 list, but we're going to do top 14 most overpowered pieces of gear, I guess, in Dust, and 5 honorable mentions. So we're doing 5 and 14 in true Dust 514 spirit. So I guess let's get on with it with the 5 honorable mentions. Actually, before that, I'm going to start with a few things that aren't going to appear on the list that maybe some people think should appear. And there's just a few of them. So we have armor stacking, so that just involved running a bunch of plates. There were a few times over the course of the game where this was particularly good, where the armor plates gave a lot of HP for not a lot of movement penalty. Very, very early in the game, the complex armor plate gave a 10% movement penalty, and that was enormous, and it only gave 110 or 135 HP, something like that. I think Uprising changed it. Uprising 1.0. I checked most of the details for most of these things, but these things early in the video I didn't check. So armor plates, I didn't have those. There were times when just stacking a bunch of HP, that was pretty much always good, even if you didn't have a whole bunch of regen to go with it, depending on what you're playing, heavy, assault, whatever. So armor plates aren't going to appear on this list. Maybe not a big shocker. Forge guns were super good at a certain point in time when their splash radius was very generous. You could just get to a high point and rain down on infantry, kill them in a few shots, like 2 or 3, kill an assault or a scout suit or whatever, and then a direct hit would kill pretty much every suit in one shot. And then you also had AV capabilities, but it didn't. If you got pushed or pressured in any way, like, it just was a very bad close quarters weapon. It only had AV and just high ground camping capabilities, really. And then we have uplinks, which were honestly maybe in competitive play and even in pub matches, I suppose, were just the most important piece of equipment. If you weren't running uplinks and just spamming uplinks in general, you just weren't doing it right. But in terms of overpowered, I'm not going to include those on the list, even though they were probably the most important thing in the meta at virtually all times. So let's get on to the 5 honorable mentions. So these are going to be in no particular order, and then the 14, they're roughly ordered, but it's very, very hard to do. Most of them didn't exist at the same time. Different things were introduced, all of that kind of stuff. So I have those ranked in an approximate order, but these 5, no particular order. So we have logistics suits. So before patch 1.8 came out and all the racial suits were released to the public, from Uprising 1.0 to I think 1.7, you had all the Logi and all the assault suits. I think you definitely had all the assault suits and most of the Logis. If not, I think you did all of them. Anyways, logistic suits, especially the Caldari and Galente, just pretty much outclass assault suits in terms of slaying capabilities. Their passive bonus on the suits was, I think it was just shield. Gosh, I should have checked this one too. It was just an HP bonus on top of when you put on shield extenders or armor plates or something like that. I think the Logi one in general might have just been shield extenders. I don't remember exactly. Anyway, so the basic idea of the thing was, especially so the Galente one was the real king, more or less. You could run, at Proto you had 3 high slots, 5 low slots. 5 low slots you could just run a bunch of armor, get a lot of HP on there. High slots you could run damage modules, which at the time Proto gave 10% damage, and I don't recall what the stacking penalty was exactly. You got to keep in mind, guys, that this was several years ago when the game shut down, and then most of these things when the RP was several years before that. So you could damage stack in the high slots, armor stack in the low slots, bunch of HP, bunch of damage, plus you had all the equipment slots. You had a lot of PG and CPU because there's a Logi suit. Very busted in its time. Assault dropships at different times when AV wasn't particularly strong and the assault dropships were very strong, they were very hard to kill. Forge guns could take them down, but by nature of dropships, they were pretty hard to hit with a forge gun in general. Swarm launchers, when they were good and could take them down, and I suppose other dropships and tanks could take them down, but in general they were just infantry slaying machines, and with the correct fit you could even just harass tanks. If you flew right above them, they couldn't aim straight up and you could just take them out. So I have them on there. Bolt pistols, which were introduced in 1.8 and were stayed pretty much the same for most of the game. The overpowered thing about them, even though the hipfire box looked to be pretty wide, technically it was pretty wide, but it was an auto aim more or less. If they were in your hipfire box, you were going to hit them, and a lot of times that was a headshot, just dealing a lot of damage. So it was a very easy mode weapon. Just pull it out, hold down the trigger. It had the little spool up time, but then it landed a body shot or a headshot, dealing several hundred damage. Especially, God, at Proto, I think it did like 200 something damage, something goofy. So that's number 3 on the honorable mentions. Then I have damage modules, which I talked a little bit about before with the Logi suits, but 10% damage increase at Proto. 3 and 5 were the standard and advanced, and those weren't really worthwhile. Maybe 1 advance if that was the last thing on your suit because you were running on a PG and CPU, but stacking damage was ridiculous. You gave up HP, which was very valuable, of course, but you could just gank people. You kill them before HP really became an issue. And finally, number 5, we have Scrambler Rifles, which a lot of people will say that they are just the most OP thing at different times in the game. And while it's true that they had very high alpha damage, you did really have to run them on the Amara Assault suit. They weren't really worthwhile outside of that. I mean, they were still good, but they weren't nearly as good. And you could take off like 500 shield HP with 1 charge shot and then get like 7 follow-up shots or whatever it was. So you could deal an absurd amount of damage in a very quick amount of time, but it still did require skill and accuracy on this one as opposed to most of the other things on the list. So those are the 5 honorable mentions, and let's get on to the 14 most OP pieces of gear, vehicles, equipment, weapons, all that kind of stuff in Dust 514. So at number 14 we have the Myofibral Stimulants from Hotfix Echo onward. So in Hotfix Echo they were changed. Myofibral Stimulants originally only increase your melee damage, but in this patch they were changed to increase your jump height as well. So you could stack as many of these as you wanted, and there was some sort of stacking penalty, but with like 5 of these on a Caldari Assault or 4 on a Minmatar Assault or whatever you wanted to run, you jumped extremely high. It was game breaking. You could access different locations, made you very hard to hit, very annoying. The reason I have them at number 14 as opposed to higher on this list is because the only way to really abuse them in combat was to run like a mass drive or something with splash damage, because although you were pretty hard to hit when you first jumped, you still had a pretty predictable path in the air after you had jumped, and it was still kind of hard to hit people on the ground. They could still strafe, move around, jump on their own if they had the mods, whatever it was. And you did have to give up HP, specifically shield HP, which towards the end of the game, shield stack was very good for quite a while, because rail and combat rifles were less effective against shield. They were more effective against armor. But then the assault rifles got buffed, and they were very good. But anyway, so number 14 here, I have the Myofibral Stimulants from Hotfix Echo to the end of the game. Clocking in at number 13 here, we have laser rifles before Uprising 1.0 launch. This is back in Chromosome. This is when I started playing. This patch lasted a few months, and this is still when it's in beta. I don't know when exactly they got this powerful, because patch notes from way back then are a little bit hard to come by. But laser rifles were just melting machines. They just absolutely wrecked at most ranges, even close range where laser rifles generally aren't as strong. They could still do pretty good damage. They were just very hard to deal with once somebody got set up with one. And so the reason I have them a little bit lower, there are things definitely more OP on the list, but this was sort of back in a time when there weren't all that many different suits and weapons. Basically, in Chromosome, you were running an assault rifle or a laser rifle, or you just weren't doing anything right. Heavies with HMGs, they really just didn't keep up with assault suits that could dance around them with assault or Logi suits that could dance around them with assault rifles, and then at range, they got super beat out by especially laser rifles. So moving on to number 12, we have Repair Hives. So this refers to Allotech and Wire Combi Triage Hives. So Allotech gave 40 per tick, 40 armor repair per tick, and I'm not exactly sure. I don't think a tick was exactly 1 second. I think it was like 1.5 seconds. I could be wrong on that, but it gave ammo and it gave 40 HP per second, and it prioritized armor over ammo, I believe. I could be wrong. It might have been ammo before armor. I'm not positive. I'm not 100% sure. And then there were wire Combi hives, which gave only armor repair. They gave 70 per tick. So on a Logi suit, you could run both of those, throw both of them down, and that's 115, 110. No, 70 and 40. 110 repair per tick, I guess. I don't know. It was probably something like 100 per second, something like that, which is ridiculous on a suit on the ground. So the thing with these, and you could even just have somebody else help you out, throw them onto the ground with yours, get an absurd, like several hundred per second, basically unkillable. But the thing with these, they could be destroyed, and they kept you sitting in one spot. So if you used them all, they ran out. If they got hit by a grenade, like a flux or a locust, they got destroyed. No longer there. Mass driver took care of them, all that kind of stuff. But if they didn't destroy the hive and they stayed on top of the hive, they were basically unkillable in a gunfight. You had to just one-shot them, maybe a shotgun or a forge gun take them out, but that's about it. They were ridiculously powerful, and it was a strategy abused by many top players for a very long time, pretty much all throughout the game, because this was never really changed to not be a strategy. At number 11, we have the Burst HMG, specifically from Hotfix Charlie to Hotfix Delta. So this only lasted about a month. This is from August 2014 to September 2014. In Hotfix Charlie, the Burst HMG was changed to have less burst delay and higher rate of fire, basically. So you just pumped out a ridiculous number of bullets. Like your RPM was like several thousand. You still were doing like 13 damage per bullet, something like that. It just insta-melted any suit. Just 2 or 3 bursts would kill even a heavy suit. 1 burst would kill pretty much any scout and a lot of assaults if you were just landing all the shots. 1 burst, I think, had 45 bullets in it. So you're landing all that, it's just over. And it had ridiculous range as well. I think I don't even really want to say it. I want to say it's like 45 meters effective or something like that. It was pretty tight, long range, high damage. It did build up heat fast, but the heat with the skills maxed out and at proto and all that kind of stuff, it still went down pretty quick. So I remember when this dropped and people were just running around in ambush. Just everybody's clustered up, a few heavies with these, and then just lodges on them. The only way you were maybe taking them out was with remote explosives, but that was if you could even get close enough, because these weapons were that ridiculous. But it was limited to only heavy suits, which didn't have great mobility or anything. They were limited in range somewhat. You could still outrange them, and you could still kill them with one-shots, and it only lasted for about a month. So I have them a little bit low, even though at the time they were just the most busted thing in the game, basically. At number 10, we have active scanners between Uprising 1.0 and Uprising 1.8. So that's May 2013 to about March 2014. So this lasted about 10 months. And the thing that made them particularly strong, and I suppose they became a little bit less effective in one. No, never mind. They got nerfed in 1.8, and that's also when the scout suits got released. So before this time, scout suits were not very popular. So the main suit that would avoid active scanners, not get scanned, was not popular in the meta. The meta consists of mostly Logis and heavies and assaults, especially Logis and heavies, which didn't have the best e-warfare skills necessarily. So everybody was getting scanned. Active scanners had a long range, and the crux of the thing, they could do a 360 scan. So you pulled it out, you pressed the button, and then you just spun around, and it scanned everywhere around you. And this was changed in 1.8 to even the widest arc scanners, I think, only had like a 90-degree scan, something like that. But before that, you could do a 360 scan with good range, capturing everybody in the map. And this is something I tried to find details on, but I couldn't really. I can't quite remember who it was shared with. At different times in the game, I think it's shared with your whole team or just your squad, and I can't remember which happened when. So I want to say it was your whole team it was shared with when this was really OP, but I'm not positive. But even if it's only yourself and your squad, it's still very strong. Now we have this down at number 10. I don't know. We're getting into questionable territory because this lasted for very, like the Burst HMGs, they only lasted for about a month, and this was like 10 months. But this can't kill on its own. It just gave info, but it was very powerful intel. You could basically scan most of the cityscape that you're in. It didn't make you invincible like the rep hives. It wasn't as game breaking as the myofibs. I would say it is pretty game breaking, But we have this at number 10 anyways. Moving on to number 9, we have Locust grenades. This includes core Locust and then the contacts. Core Locust was good pretty much through the entire game. Locust grenades at the lower level, the standard and the advanced, weren't especially good. They were only dealing like 3, 4, 500 damage at different times in the game. Not really worth it, but the core Locust grenades dealing 600 damage was ridiculous. You could have 3 way back when, if I remember correctly, and then 2 a little bit later. But even when you got 2, it was still very, very strong. I think it was 48 PG, 48 CPU, 6 PG to fit it, and that might have been changed by the skills or changed at different times, but it was throughout the entire game, 600 damage. You could cook it, hit somebody with it as you're coming around the corner, and then you just had such a massive advantage in that gunfight if that's how that went down. But those were pretty well an established part of the meta. It took a little bit to fit on your suit. You had to cook them. You had to be at least a little bit skillful with them, with the cook time and whatnot. Not especially because it had a very generous, very wide blast radius. But the reason I have them higher up on the list here, the Locust grenades, is the contact grenades. Early in Uprising, between about 1.0 and 1.3, and that's about 2 months. That's May 2013 to July 2013, I believe. The contact grenades were ridiculous. You had more than one of them. You just threw them right at the ground. It was like the core Locust grenades, except you didn't even have to cook them. You just threw them right at the ground. You had more than one, so it was reasonable to use them all in a gunfight, because you didn't cook a core Locust grenade, throw it, and then enter the gunfight, and then just start cooking another one. You cooked it, threw it, started shooting. These, you could throw it. If there was a third one, which I think there was, you could just throw all 3, kill pretty much any suit. The damage, I want to say it was just 600 like the core Locust. I could be wrong on that. It was at least 400. But if you threw 2 or 3 of those, that's 800 to 1200. Even if they're only doing 400, they had pretty much the same blast radius, I believe. And again, most of this stuff is as I remember it, because of some of this stuff I couldn't find details on. So that's number 9, core Locust grenades / contact grenades. Number 8, we have assault rifles, and this was throughout a couple periods of time. So assault rifles were the dominant weapon before 1.7, when the combat rifles and rail rifles were released. So this was everything basically before December 2013. So I suppose if you want to go from when the game was released, this lasted about 7 months. So May 2013 to December 2013. Assault rifles were just the king of the game. HMGs had their place. They did their own thing, but assault rifles outclassed them in a lot of regard, as long as you weren't very close to them. But assault rifles had range. They didn't have the overheat mechanic. They didn't have the extremely long reload, and they weren't limited to only heavy suits. Especially overpowered ones were the Duval Tactical, which very early on, I can't remember when this was changed, or if it was changed. I'm pretty sure it was, but the Duval Tactical had basically no fire cap, so you were shooting at pretty much the same rate of fire as the assault, as fast as your trigger finger could pull it, or even faster if you have a modded controller, which some people did back then, and the game did have mouse and keyboard capability, so that lets you do it a little bit faster than a controller generally. So it had basically the same fire rate as the regular assault rifle, but much higher damage, very accurate, good scope on it. It was a dot sight as opposed to just the iron sights that the regular assault rifle had, and it was just absolutely silly. Assault rifles were king for a long, long time. At the end of the game, assault rifles were buffed again, and it depends. Combat rifles and rail rifles were still good at the end. Like, a lot of people still stuck with their assault rail rifles. Some people like their combat rifles, whatever it was. But the assault rifles were really good again. They got a big rate of fire buff, and they just absolutely shredded shields. And shield fits were popular with a lot of people. It was pretty much the only way to run the scouts, because otherwise you're giving up your mobility. And then a lot of people just like to be fast on their Logi or assault suits or whatever, so they would shield stack as opposed to armor stack. And assault rifles ripped through shields, which is something that combat and rail rifles couldn't do at the end of the game, when rail rifles were doing 10% less to shield and combat rifles were doing 15% less damage to shield. So that was assault rifles. That's basically assault rifles I guess all of 2013, and then I'm not sure which hotfix it was. I couldn't find very good details after the 4th hotfix, after Delta, and I want to say maybe this did happen in Delta, I'm not sure. not positive, but towards the end of the game and very early in the game, assault rifles were ridiculous. Number 7 here on the list, we have Flaylock pistols, specifically from 1.0 to 1.3 Uprising. If you played after that, you might have thought of the Flaylock pistols as just sort of a joke or just not the greatest weapon, and they were a secondary. And that's part of the reason I have them so high up here on the list, higher than assault rifles. So they were only OP for about 2 months from the game's release in May 2013 to July 2013. But you could run the Proto, and gosh, I don't even remember if it's 3 or 4 shots in the clip. I think it was 4 with the maxed out skills. I think that's what the skill was. It gave you a bigger clip. So I want to say it's 4. I could be wrong. It could be 3. And it shot pretty fast. The projectile didn't have much drop, and it traveled pretty fast, unlike the Mass Driver, which had a decent bit of drop and was kind of a slow projectile. But it was doing 195 splash damage and like 220 direct damage. So you pull out your... Well, I suppose since this is it's an explosive weapon, so it had a 20% damage reduction to shields, 20% damage increase to armor. So you took your assault rifle, you decimated their shields, you pulled this out, you just shot at their feet, you killed them, because it's doing... I guess like 250 armor damage, something like that, just off splash damage. Pretty close to. It was ridiculous. Every good player would run it as their secondary. There was no reason not to. It outclassed everything. If you're up high, you could just peek your head out, pop all 3 shots, maybe 4 shots, whatever it was, at their feet, do ridiculous amount of damage, go back to hiding up high. They were just the king of the meta. Absolutely absurd to play against. It wasn't even a very skillful weapon. Like the assault rifles, you had to land your shots, right? Flaylock pistols, you just had to get near them. You just had to hit them with the splash damage. You could hit them with direct shot, but it's not that much bonus damage. So that is number 7 on the list, Flaylock pistols. Moving on to number 6, we have scout suits and cloaks from Uprising 1.8 to Hotfix Alpha. So this is about 3 months. This is March 2014 to June 2014. When the scout suits were released, they were just king, basically. Their one downfall, of course, was the low HP, but they had the highest mobility of any suit. They had the best e-warfare capabilities of any suit, and they were the only ones that realistically had any access to the cloak field, which was an absurd piece of equipment. So the cloak field, when you had it on, it would make you go pretty much basically invisible when you weren't moving, and then it was still hard to see when you were moving. It just kind of a shimmer effect. And the scout suits themselves they were hard to scan, had very good scanning capabilities. So the 2 that were especially powerful were the Caldari and the Galente. So the Caldari is the one I ran back then. I ran on Proto. You had 4 high slots, 2 low slots, so it would be 3 shield extenders, 1 range amp, I think was in the high slot, and then in the low slot it was the dampener and precision enhancer, I think is the name of it. So basically 1 increase your scan range, 1 increase your scan precision, and 1 makes you harder to scan. So with that fit, except for the most dedicated suits would scan you, or only the most dedicated suits would scan you rather, and you would scan pretty much everything on the map within like 100 meters around you, and you had the cloak field. The reason other suits couldn't run the cloak field, they took a ridiculous amount of CPU and PG, and the scout suits passive reduced that by like 75%, I think, so it made it reasonable to fit on your shit. You could fit it on like an assault or logi, but it took up most of your CPU and PG. It was just not good to run. So you could just run a suit that's fast, hard to see, hard to scan, always sees you, and to compound it, the ridiculously overpowered combat and rail. Although they'd been nerfed at this time, the combat and rail rifles were still the best guns in the game, and you had access to either one, whichever one you wanted. And it was just absurd. In Hotfix Alpha, the scout suits, the e-warfare capabilities, specifically on the Galente and the Caldari, were nerfed, and then the cloak field was also nerfed in some way. I think I'm not sure if it was this patch or a future one. At 2 different times, I forgot to mention. One of the most broken things about the cloak field, the time that you could go from having it up to pulling out your weapon. So you could just press the switch button and you automatically switch to your shotgun or whatever gun. That was very popular as well, especially in PCs when the meta was pretty much always Logis with repair tools, heavies with HMGs, and scouts with shotguns and remote explosives. You could just instantly switch to your shotgun or remote and throw it or shoot or whatever you're going to do. And the cloaks at Proto, it was like 80 or 90 seconds, so you could just stay in it for a very long time. It only took half that time to recharge. Everything was ridiculous about it. Eventually, it was nerfed to take a third of a second to switch, and that wasn't enough, so they had to change to a full second, and that was pretty significant. That was a big nerf to the cloak. So if you got spotted, you had to decloak, and it took you like a full second that they could still shoot you. But until that time, for about 3 months, scouts absolutely dominated the game. Something else was dominating the game at that time too, but since you were a scout and you were hard to see, and I'll get to that, it's higher up on the list. The scouts were good at avoiding them and taking infantry fights. Number 5 on the list here, we have combat rifles, specifically from Uprising 1.7 to 1.8. They were still really good after 1.8. They got a nerf, and I think they got another nerf in one of the hot fixes, but they were never not good, combat and rail rifles. In 1.7 especially, they had before 1.7 dropped, like we talked about before, the assault rifles were just king of the game, but they just totally outclassed assault rifles in pretty much every way. They dealt more damage to armor, which generally people had more armor stack could produce more HP than shield stack could. The shield extender at complex before the skills was only 66, and the armor plates were like 110 or 135. I can't remember which one it was at this time. It was just, you could get way more armor, and the combat rifle especially had a very good damage profile. It dealt 5% less damage to shield and 10% more damage to armor. So it was the only one that was imbalanced to where it gave you a bigger benefit. Every other thing, it was minus X plus X. So rail rifles were minus 10% to shields, plus 10% to armor. Combat rifles were minus 5% to shields, plus 10% to armor. So they absolutely shredded. The combat rifle was a 3-round burst. The assault combat rifle was full auto, but that wasn't nearly as good. It got buffed a little bit later, but it wasn't nearly as good. So the combat rifle, it was, I think, 54 in the clip. You could shoot basically as fast as you wanted. I think the fire cap was like 1200 or something, which was, you could get close to that since it was a 3-round burst. So you didn't have to pull the trigger for each individual shot. It was debated at this time which one was the better one. They each did their own kind of things. Rail rifles was thought of as being the longer range weapon, and it was. It had the longer effective range, better drop off. But the combat rifle, maxed out with the recoil skills, it still had very, very good range. Both were better than the assault rifles. The combat rifle could even compete with the rail rifles. Rail rifles were just generally easier to use. You just held down the trigger. Combat rifles, you had to pull it over and over and over. But the combat rifle DPS was basically unmatched. Both were ridiculous. Both were easy to use. Very, very strong. Outclassed every other gun in the game. Very powerful. Number 5 on the list. Moving on to number 4, we have, from Uprising 1.0 to Hotfix Bravo, remote explosives. So their reign lasted over a year, and they were still good after the nerf. Which, this one is another one I couldn't find the exact details on. I believe it was in Hotfix Bravo because the notes kind of talked about it. It didn't mention the throw range nerf, which was the biggest thing, but it mentioned a detonation increased time nerf. So it took you like twice as long to detonate it, and then also you couldn't just use the basic remotes. You had to use the complex ones if you wanted to one-shot all heavies. The regular remote explosives and the advanced ones, you could still one-shot pretty much everything besides a heavy, but these were heavy killers, and you had to use the boundless if you wanted to take out the heavies. So what was so good about them? It was a piece of equipment, so it didn't take up your primary slot, your grenade slot, or your secondary slot, any of that. Unfortunately, it did take up your grenade, or the same slot as uplinks. So these were for dedicated killing suits. The scout suits had a second slot, so you could run, cloak plus remote, uplink plus whatever you wanted to do. And when these were still good, you were pretty much always using the remote. They were so ridiculously good at killing. So they could one-shot pretty much every suit, but they could also one-shot more than one person with one go. So you threw out your boundless remote explosive into a group of people, and you got like 4 kills. Ask, who was Sergeant Nonek or Pack or Yoshi. a lot of people just be throwing these remotes, and I mean, why not? You got so rewarded for doing so little work. You didn't really have to aim them like a rifle. You just threw them into a crowd of people. They had very long range, so you would jump before them, and you got very good range, and then you just blew them up pretty quick. Much faster than a heavy had time to run away from, and maybe other suits could run away from them, but definitely not if they didn't see it coming, which a lot of times they didn't, because you just ran them on a fast suit. They were an established part of the PC meta. Like I said before, the meta for a lot of the time, it consisted of mostly scouts with shotguns and remotes, and heavies with HMGs, and then the Logis with repair tools, and then you could also run a rifle if you want, if you were really good, or especially if you were on an outside objective, you could run a rifle on like an assault suit or whatever you wanted to do. But that was only for the most part on the outside objectives, and at least half of any PC map is inside. Two or three objectives is going to be inside in the city. So that's remote explosive. It was probably the most irritating part of the game because it lasted so long. They were so good. You just died in one shot. There was no counter to them. It's not like you could reasonably shoot them out of the air or blow them out of the flux. You could flux them if somebody planted them on the console to stop you from hacking, but if you were just using them as a combat tool, it was unstoppable. Remote explosives were ridiculous for a very long time, and they were still good after that time. Moving on to number 3 here, we have a lot of people's favorites. We have the officer weapons, and they were all good, of course. A lot better than others. The two I want to talk about specifically were the Agamis mass driver and the Bonds shotgun. These were both absolute basically no skill weapons. These were released in Warlords 1.0 back in February 2015. So they lasted from then to the end of the game. So about 15 months. These were out. They were terror of the game for the entire time. They were limited in one regard in that they were rare. Relatively rare for a time. When player trading was released, then you could get access to a bunch, but they generally sold for a few $100,000 a piece, 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 on average. So very rich players could have access to basically an unlimited amount, but the average player couldn't have just an absolute ton of them. So the Agamis just did very high damage, very ridiculous blast radius on the mass driver. And the Bonds was a full auto shotgun that did high damage. It would one-shot scout suits. It would one-shot low HP assault suits, two-shot every other suit that's not a heavy, and then like 3 or 4-shot a heavy. But the 4 shots came out so fast, they just outgunned everything. It was the scourge of PC. This is something that ruined the game. The combination of officer gear and player trading, it was over. PC was just ruined. If you weren't spamming it, you could not compete at the highest level. Yeah, it was absurd. But okay, so we don't have them in number 1 or number 2, so maybe you're a little bit surprised. Maybe you know what's coming. I talked about it a little bit before. Let's move on to number 2. We have Hotfix Alpha. 1.7 to Hotfix Alpha tanks. And the tanks were still good. Past Hotfix Alpha, this is when they started to get nerfed. So in 1.7, things were changed. Basically, all AV was nerfed. AV grenades and swarm launchers especially were super nerfed. Just lower damage, lower range, all that kind of stuff. And tanks were buffed. They were reworked, really. You could stack a lot of HP, a ridiculous amount of reps, like several hundred reps, and then you could also have a fuel injector on your tank. And fuel injectors at the time were busted. Like, you moved at absurd rates, like unintended rates. So you could just get out of dodge. The only way to kill these tanks was maybe multiple AV against a not good pilot, because realistically, even if you're fighting against multiple anti-vehicle infantry, you could still use your fuel injector to just get out of there. So the only way to fight a tank was with another tank. That was it. There was no other way to kill him. If you were playing in a pub match and you were outside at all, it was over for you. You were just going to die. You had to hide inside. You had to let the tanks duke it out outside, and you had to just stay away from them. Whoever had the better tanker was probably just going to win. It was, I guess, an ambush OMS. Ambush, they took out tanks at some point. I don't remember when exactly. And then skirmish and domination, depending on which map it was, you could kind of avoid tanks, because a lot of the objectives were sort of where tanks couldn't reach, but traveling between objectives was very hard because of tanks. They were ridiculous. And then again in another patch, they were changed again. One of the hotfixes later, they become really stupid again. I think in the beginning of 2015. So their original reign of terror was December 2013 to June 2014. So 6 months. And then AV finally got somewhat of a buff. The biggest thing I think was AV grenades got buffed quite a bit, so they were somewhat effective at taking out tanks. You threw 3 AV grenades really fast at a tank, and you could take out most, if not all, of its HP, depending on the build. And then AV got some buffs here and there, and the hotfixes finally addressed that. But for the longest time, tanks were virtually unkillable. So for most of this time, the meta really was just tanks were driving around outside, avoid them at all costs, and then the only way to avoid them was running your scout suit with your cloak and staying inside, that kind of stuff. So number 1, I don't know, maybe you know it. Comment down below if you know what number 1 is. You might just this is a little bit of an old one. It's from way back when. If you didn't play the game in the early stages, you don't really know about this as much. Uprising 1.0 to Uprising 1.4 murder taxis. And murder taxis were a thing throughout the entire game. It was just, you took an LAV and you just tried to run people over. But it was especially ridiculous at this point. There were Logi LAVs, which could stack HP, and the passive was damage resistance. So you could get, I think, up to something like 90% damage resistance. So all damage you took from any source was negligible, because you had like 90% damage reduction plus like 2,000 HP. So no damage was going to kill you. There was no way. You were fast because you were an LAV, and the collision mechanics were what ruined this. You could be going very, very slow, any speed, touch an infantry, they would die. If you went outside, it was over for you. I don't know. I sort of think that putting this number 1 on the list is a little bit questionable, because it was sort of limited at what it could do. If you were inside, you really weren't getting hit by these. It didn't have that big of an impact on the game, but they were unkillable. The only way to kill one of these was to ram it with another one, like head on, hope they both explode, or to hit it with a tank. That's about it. Even a tank wasn't fast enough to keep up with it, didn't do enough damage to really take care of it. Maybe if you hit it with like back-to-back rail shots, that's about it. There was no counter to this. Absolutely no counter. The most busted, in my opinion, the most busted thing in the game. So 1.0 to 1.4, like I said before, that lasted about 3 months. So that's May 2013 to August 2013. And eventually logistics LAVs were removed in Uprising 1.7. So in December that year of 2013, they were eventually removed completely. The thing that nerfed them originally in 1.4 was collision mechanics were changed. They were still strong. You still just got up to speed and just ran over people and were unstoppable, but you didn't kill people going at no speed at all. So that's the list. That's 1 through 14. Let me know in the comments below what you think about the list. If anything should have been higher, if I forgot anything, if anything should have been lower, that kind of stuff. Or let me know if I got any details wrong. There were a lot of specifics that I wasn't sure on, because again, it's been multiple years since I've had exposure to any of this stuff. The dates I'm pretty confident in. I looked up on a couple timelines. I cross-referenced that kind of stuff. The notable dates on here, I had them written down. So you had Uprising 1.0 in May 2013, Uprising 1.3 in July 2013, 1.4 was in August 13, Uprising 1.7 in December that year, Uprising 1.8 in March 14, and then Alpha Bravo, Charlie Delta hotfixes were in respectively June, August, and September, and then Warlords 1.0 is the final relevant patch to this video, which was the one with the officer gear. That was in February of 2015. So that's pretty much what I got. I'm gonna see what kind of video I can put under this. I'm definitely not gonna have each segment split up where it shows the gear, because I don't reasonably have access to videos of all these things, highlighting them and whatnot. I'll just find some video. Gosh, it's 40 minutes already. Well, anyways, that's what I got for you. Again, let me know in the comments below. I would consider making more of these videos if people are interested, but realistically, I probably won't get around to doing that soon. So let me know if there's anything you do want to see, and I'll consider getting around to. But anyways, I will catch you guys next time.